This episode is called The Magical Negro: The Burden of Biracial Survivors, and How Parental Dynamics Shape Racial Conditioning and the Misuse of Black Scholarship. Welcome. I am your host, Dr. Erica Steele, and this episode is long and coming, let me tell you. So, first thing I want to do is I want to define what the magical Negro trope is. So there's this racialized expectation that biracial people exist to serve, heal, or fix racism for white people without centering their own identity or their struggles. And so I am a Black biracial, although at this point I'm just a Black woman. And so I have been on countless lives on TikTok and various different debates and discussions and even just on social media, we were always being inundated with Black, white people together and, oh, look at the little mixed babies. Oh, look at, they're so beautiful. Oh, da, da, da. You know, and it really has it just makes me sick. Being a Black biracial myself and also having a biracial child, has really shown me this idea and this ideology of the magical Negro, because it's almost as though we are poised to be the fix or the cure of racism. And that is not our role in life. And in fact, when two unconscious people couple without awareness of their family history, their family background, their genetic, their ancestral components, and they combine, they don't realize that they're creating that chemical reaction for that child to now have to process through all of that trauma. And that's what happened with myself. When I was growing up, very challenging childhood, lots of confusion around racial identity, not a whole lot of answers, not a whole lot of understanding, but this idea that I was some sort of magical Negro, that I could go in and out of spaces, with a single bound, and I could be palatable and, all of these things. And so it really impacts us as biracial individuals because we grow up with vast identity challenges, because we're dragging around our YT parent and we uphold them unconsciously, very much like Stockholm. And so biracial individuals are uniquely conditioned based on their parental dynamics. And so we're going to discuss in this episode when a white mother versus a white father is present, because there's different dynamics that exist between conditioning. The broader the historical context of racial identity formulation, and also how it plays into this forced assimilation, this forced integration, again, like I said, identity confusion, and really the dilution of radical Black thinking, because it's not about liberation or oppression, it's about subjugation and it's about palatability. And so we'll also discuss the misuse of Black scholarship as an extension of this condition. So let's first talk about the white mother and Black father dynamic. So, and the influences of white motherhood on racial identity. So, the two scholars that I will be referencing is Dr. Joy DeGroy with post-traumatic slave syndrome, and Bell Hooks, Ain't I a Woman? So, the Black man and the white woman's relationship has long been hyper scrutinized due to racist mythology of Black men as being a threat to white women. And so white mothers often teach their biracial children to downplay their Blackness to fit into a white society. They emphasize being colorblind and racially assimilating and not seeing race, but instead teaching racial self-defense. And this results, unfortunately, in internalized racism, mass identity confusion, and the avoidance of Black radicalism. And so there is this impact again between a Black daughter versus a Black son. And so Black daughters often are over policed in white spaces. They're taught to be palatable and to embody white femininity. So they may actually reject their, Black womanhood as a form of survival. Now they are trying to fit into this white world, this colorless world. And Black sons face hypermasculinization, encouraged to be a safe Black man who doesn't challenge the power structure. So they have learned to now dilute themselves and to be, again, more palatable. And so, white mothers who don't properly educate their children on Black history raise biracial children who misrepresent Black intellectual work. Like, for instance, I was on a live several weeks ago, and a biracial woman was actually misquoting Dr. Joy DeGruy's work and the core principles of her work around forced integration and the mental and emotional impact. She, again, was exhibiting this palatability, and she was speaking to a primarily white audience. And so she was trying to water down and whitewash Dr. Joy DeGruy's work, which, it takes real talent, I must say. But this really speaks to her level of deconstruction. And so, again, wanting to help, the white people get it, and wanting to support them, and, encourage them, and in turn labor for them, which again, culturally, historically, systemically is not her role. But again, that magical Negro, let's help all the racist white people. Let's get them in check, because biracial individuals with white mothers may gravitate towards being that racial diplomat rather than engaging in real resistance. So they're not going to be. So when I came up on the panel, obviously I was very opinionated with what I said. And, she didn't like it. Again, colorless world, we've got to work together as a team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we have tried that. We have done that. We have worked through that. That has been the constant struggle. And unfortunately, it just doesn't work. And again, Dr. Joy DeGruy really just knocks this home in terms of forced integration. We have been forced to integrate in, and the only area of liberation that white people have, used their privilege to leverage is the opportunity to have, to be with us sexually, or to be with us, in that subjugated marriage sort of setting. So now let's kind of switch to the white father and Black mother dynamic. And for this, I'm going to reference Dr. Frances Cress Welsing with the ISIS Papers, and then Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X. So the white man and the Black woman's relationship traces back to slavery, where white men fathered mixed race children through rape and coercion. So that fetishization still actually lives on today. And in fact, white fathers may actually fetishize their biracial children as exotic, while offering no real cultural grounding. So they're not allowed to express themselves culturally. That goes out of the palatability, the social norms, the, the, conditioning. But you, as a Black child, get to be fetishized a lot of times with white fathers. They will do the sex talks with their children. They will kind of control that narrative. And Black mothers may then overcompensate by ensuring that their children are connected to Black culture. Because remember, the Black mother's partnership with the white male is birthed out of anti-Blackness, is birthed out of a lack of self-love, self-confidence, self-acceptance, self-appreciation. So she's going to leave and abandon her culture to now, pretty much take on the culture of the father. White fathers also often reinforce this kind of superiority complex in biracial children, and they give them proximity to whiteness as making them feel above other Black people. So white fathers, again, will indoctrinate in a lot of ways their biracial children into believing, whatever they want them to believe. And if they step out of that belief system, if they step out of that structure, then, there's hell to pay. There's retribution that happens. And so white fathers also condition their children that this is the way you need to be, and you need to, operate in a certain way, and in order for you to gain some sort of crumbs of acceptance. And so the impact on Black daughters is they may experience extreme exotification and be hypersexualized in both white and Black spaces. I know for myself, being a Black biracial, but having a white father and a Black mother, I could literally with pennies become millionaire of how many times somebody's come up to me and said, "Oh my God, you're so exotic, you're so gorgeous, you're so beautiful," and very much unsolicited. And it's not that other people don't experience this, it's just the level to which. And I remember even being very young, and a lot of just, you know, being hyper adultified and, grown men, being very, very attracted and very, very, predatory. Black sons may also adopt white patriarchal views, believing in respectability politics, which is just, oh, let's just try to find the common ground here, right? There's no common ground when it comes to racism. Either you're deconstructing your racism or you are deconstructing your anti Blackness or you're not, right? You're either present to the fact that this is a problem in society that we have all been conditioned in, or you're not. And so avoiding, repressing, denying, pretending that these things don't exist is not helping us. In fact, that's why we have our racist in chief in office, is because people don't want to have these difficult conversations with their families, with their friends, with their colleagues, et cetera. They much rather, again, respectability politics, and they'd rather make it comfortable for everyone. Even having these conversations with my own family yielded lots of reactions, because how could you? Oh my God, this is horrible. You must be getting this from the media, like all kinds of, denial, avoidance, repression, and then just inevitable gaslighting because they don't want to see and they don't want to look. So, when white fathers raise biracial children who see themselves as special and not subject to Black struggles. And so this often results in more of a cosmopolitan or intellectual distancing from Black radical movements, leading to misrepresentation of Black history and scholarship. So, as an example, biracial individuals claiming that racism is nuanced, oh, they didn't really mean it like that. That was just, oh, Billy's just, or there requires this both sides when citing Dr. King while ignoring his later critiques of white supremacy. So it's very much, oh, we have a dream, rather than focusing on the burning building. And so there's an incompleteness. It's like a cherry picking of all of the good parts, but not necessarily really acknowledging the true breadth of it. Because again, you have to be willing to do that level of work within self. By the time I got to kind of my ancestral, and the reason I kind of dug this deep in my own healing process is because ultimately nothing else was working. I had worked through my physical health issues. I worked through, a lot of my environmental health issues. I had kind of created this little utopia for myself. And I worked with a lot of mental health and mental health professionals, processing out a lot of the emotional woundings from the past. But I was still generating and still manifesting kind of these same relationships and, different people, of course, but similar dynamics, and I was consistently feeling less than, but then hyper sexualized, hyper in, conditioned to believe that I was, some sort of savior to this idea that, and also too, I want to say that there's not a lot of acknowledgement to racism when you are a biracial child, because acknowledgement of racism would mean that one would acknowledge their role in racism. And so they don't necessarily want to touch that part of it because that is too much. That hits too close to home. So it's better off if we leave it over here. So that may be oh, that's nice, honey. I'm glad you're learning about that, but not necessarily internalizing it. And so I have a real problem with people that are unconsciously coupling. And again, what do I mean by unconscious coupling? So after I did the work on my mental emotional state, it really opened me up spiritually, and my ancestors were just yelling at me at a certain point. Like they definitely are, are very direct. And so it brought me to so many different places around the world in order to heal and unpack these things. And as I began to unpack these things, and I would have these like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what to call them. It would be like these real intense emotional healing processes where like I just felt like so much was vomiting out, and I would have visions and see things and feel things and all sorts of things. And so eventually I got to the point of recognizing that, my father's people had poisoned my mother's people in the lineage. And so again, unconscious coupling. So they didn't know that. Why didn't they know that? Because they didn't even really talk about that, other than being, being both Marines and one being from Chicago and one being from Michigan. They're really, and they both loved, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They really didn't have much in common and much to talk about. So really having conversations that require great depth and nuance, as well as like doing any kind of generational work or looking at, they were both escaping from trauma, and they were both escaping, their own difficulties in their own lives. And so the blinders were on. And then the Marine Corps definitely, support blinders being on. I mean, they encourage it, they train you in it. The compartmentalization is wild. And so unfortunately, they were unaware of this. So when they decided to have me, it created this chemical reaction. And this chemical reaction was that of trauma. So I was always kind of carrying these burdens of trauma that I could never really get to until I started working with plant medicines and, was starting to work with some mestizos and, some different indigenous healers to really get to these root core issues. My father laughed at it, my mother applauded it, but still it's still one of those things that's over there, right? And even though I don't speak to either one of my parents anymore, I find solace in recognizing that, again, my burden is not to be the magical Negro. It's not to end racism. It's not to, oh, you're one of the cute mixed ones, right? In fact, I find that whole thing abhorrent. We're not cakes, we're not cookies, we're not puppies, we're not mixed. Even though my lineage is very diverse, I literally have been my DNA shows colonization and colonizers. So I'm literally colonized by myself. And again, having to deconstruct that one part of myself colonizing another part of myself, severe identity issues, severe self-esteem, self-worth, all kinds of things, because literally there's one part of you that's holding another part of you back. And when I was doing that part of the healing work, oh my gosh, like the level of oppression, like self-oppression that I was putting myself under, and then the fear, and there's so much that your nervous system is so conditioned to and used to. I liken it to healing from Stockholm, because you are so wildly unaware, because society is giving you such, they're constantly fawning over you, and, in such unhealthy ways, oh my God, you're so beautiful. Oh my God. And while, flattery is nice and, sweet or whatever, it's coming from such a distorted place. I'm not being seen as myself. I'm being seen as this magical Negro, this, I'm not too black, keep it light, but I'm not, totally white. So there's a little bit of, so you're exotic, or, oh, you're so well spoken, or, all of these messages growing up really reinforce, this idea that I'm not like them. I'm a magical Negro. And so when you go out into the world, you don't necessarily self-identify. In fact, you separate yourself out. You tend to other yourself because you're not like them, so you're just in your own category. When in reality, if you are phenotypically Black, then you are a Black person. And so healing your identity issues, healing your wounding, and really discovering your ancestry. This is very deep work, I must admit. This is not something that I would recommend to anybody who's like just getting started in their own self-identity, but I definitely think that this level of deconstruction is required for every biracial child, person on this planet, because we don't even realize the trauma that we are storing and we are holding on literally that's been already pre-programmed in our DNA. So intergenerational trauma is very real and we are very unconscious to how this impacts us. For me, it showed up in my relationships over and over and it was literally like Groundhog Day, which ironically that's my birthday. Every single time I would get into a relationship didn't matter. It was always the same similar dynamic of subjugation, of oppression, of oh, you're so this, but you're too much, So tone it down, Erica. Keep it light, Erica. All of these messages external. And so when I broke free from that and really started to question and find myself and do that deep digging in those deep hard dives, I lost a lot of people along the way. I also gained a lot of people too who were rooting for my authenticity. But many people benefited from me being inauthentic because I was the highest paid house Negro, because of my palatability, I was definitely given access and privileges beyond what most, what some Black people would have gained. And so even though, I was in some way acknowledging, not rooted, but acknowledging my Blackness, I definitely hadn't done any deconstruction around my anti-Blackness. And so I literally was just operating, as I had been conditioned and programmed to operate. So when we talk about, so Dr. Frances Cress Welsing talks about the fear of Black genetics. And so in the ISIS papers, she talks about white supremacy operating on a deep fear of Black genetic dominance. And this is why Blackness is constantly diluted in our society. And so, there is a fear that white people have about us being fully empowered and fully in our melanin and fully healed. And so biracial individuals are often used to reinforce whiteness while maintaining that illusion of racial progress. And so, again, we are, foot soldiers to uphold YT supremacy and uphold these ideas and these structures. We are unconscious to that, though. I know I was very unconscious to that until I just could not be that house Negro anymore. I could not keep working and working and working and not being seen and not being heard. I just could not continue to mammy the society around me. And so oftentimes biracial people will often struggle with their identity. And so we hear them, okay, what's your race? Oh, I'm Black, I'm white, I'm mixed, I'm this, I'm that. Again, we're not cupcakes, we're not cookies, we're not puppies, but also too, we are, phenotypically, we present a certain way. You're either Black biracial or white biracial. And so you're not going to show up as mixed. You're going to show up as either Black or white, but there is this allegiance, there is this, you know, loyalty, blind loyalty that is literally programmed into us to drag our white parent around with us. And I remember, during my deconstruction process, deciding because I used to identify, oh, I'm Black biracial, whatever. It kind of took time. Again, I kind of got into the culture of, oh, I'm mixed, right? And then it was, oh, I'm biracial, and then it was, I'm just Black. Like I don't need to drag my white parent into the room. People don't need to know I have a white parent. And let them wonder, let them think, let them, do whatever. I don't need to prove myself to anyone. And so because of that, and also because of your upbringing, I mean, I don't remember any kind of conversations around Blackness growing up. I remember walking to school and being called the N-word, and that was my first experience with racism. And I was probably, I think, in fifth grade at that time. And, I grew up in predominantly white spaces, naturally, because that's part of the conditioning too, create palatability and make sure, you can, be that magical Negro for people and tap dance massa, and so make sure that everyone around you feels comfortable while you are slowly dying inside. And so they're given, Black biracials were given, and biracial people in general, were given just enough whiteness to be accepted in society, but never enough Blackness to be truly fully embraced by the Black community. And so, because of post traumatic slave syndrome, there is a lot of dissension within the Black community. We have the diaspora wars, we have the red pills, we have the passport bros, we have, just an attack on Black women. We have, a infantilization of Black men. We have a hyper policing of Black men, and all of these dynamics are still existing within our social construct. And so, again, Dr. Joy DeGroy talks about this distortion of Black history. So that forced integration did not solve racism. So just because now we can mix and mingle does not mean racism is over. Because you can have sex with, somebody of a different race and produce a child, that does not mean that racism is over. In fact, you are now birthing that child into a highly hostile and toxic environment. I remember my white grandmother, so my father's mother, you know, even said to my parents, my parents were married and all that when they decided to have a child, me, she goes, "Why would you want to bring a child into this world like that?" And of course, you hear that from your grandparent and it's shocking, but in reality, she was sharing something that was true. Why would you want to bring a child into this world, where they have to now be forced to deal with so much trauma and so much identity challenges and no, never accepted. So even with my white tea family, I was never really accepted, even though they tolerated me, acceptance wasn't really a thing. And even when I tried to get close, it was a matter of trying to subjugate me, trying to, get me to do something, again, being that magical Negro, trying to get me to fix whatever problems they had at the time. And I was just there to serve a role. But I was never really seen for my beauty, aside from, all of the characteristics of, "Oh, you're so cute," all of that, but never really seen for my inner beauty, never really seen for, my talents, my gifts, my ability. It was more so I'm an extension of them and I'm a tool of them. And they could never really kind of break out of that cycle. And then on my mother's side, unfortunately, because of intergenerational trauma, there's so much, just fragmentation and disconnection and mental health and addiction issues, that it even made it very difficult to even connect with that aspect. So again, the trauma just continues generation after generation. And again, this forced integration didn't just solve all of these years, and it actually weakened Black self sufficiency. So, biracial individuals, again, who misquote Black scholars, which that was the original premise of me doing this episode, was being on a panel, on a YT panel, YT male panel, and talking to this biracial woman who's misquoting Dr. Joy DeGroy, and again, being that magical Negro, trying to appease and trying to make it palatable and water it down and it's okay, it's not your fault. No, like, the white people have the power of the systems and control of the systems that they benefit from. And they're privileged with that. And so we don't see mass deconstructions. We don't see lots of communication around deconstruct as white people, let's get our racism in check. No, and so I was, like, absolutely aghast that out of all of the Black scholars to white-splain Dr. Joy DeGroy and post-traumatic slave syndrome was definitely not. And so, again, but this really speaks to that deeper issue that when a biracial gets on a panel and they misquote a Black scholar, often ignoring the systemic roots of racism in favor of individualism, they're really just making it palatable for white people. And they are leaving out that forced integration impact on the Black community. However, that's the very foundation of her argument, is that one day we were enslaved by white people, by our oppressors. And then the next day it was like, "Oh, okay, Jimmy, you've been being beaten, raped, subjugated, but, here, this is your friend, this is your neighbor. And so I found even in relationships with white men, I could never truly be myself. I could never truly relax. I could never truly just let down because again, I'm a tool. I'm an object. I am there to serve in some way. One of the trends that just again, was the black wife effect. And so, watching these, white men be transformed, so to speak, by these black women, while on the surface may seem, oh, that's so nice, that again is rooted in racism because it's not our job to fix or repair what is broken. But unfortunately, that's what white men view us as. We are there to serve them in whatever way, sexually, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, whatever our gifts and our abilities are, that is what is for them, and they're very superior to that. And so don't think that just because you serve them that you have value. No, 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 no. You have no value, and what you are doing is just, like again, if I won't make this personal, but if I could read back to you some of the things that I've been written when I'm going through this deconstruction, when I'm standing in my blackness, like you would be just, it's abhorrent, that anybody would communicate to their child or to their family members in this way. But again, this is the concept that, we as magical Negroes are not, we're not there to be part of the liberation. In fact, we just by our life is supposed to be liberated enough. And so we should be lucky to sit at their feet and do their bidding. And so in Bell Hooks's Ain't I a Woman, the policing of blackness within biracial identity. So why are biracial individuals more likely to be whitewashed black feminism? Because that's part of the cultural conditioning, that white gaze in racial discourse. And so biracial women often align with white feminist narratives. So you'll see, them kind of jumping on the bandwagon and wanting to kind of get aside their oppressors to kind of go into this feminist movement. However, it really erases Black feminist scholarship. It perpetuates anti Blackness by rejection of intersectionality. So, it's always like, oh, I'm a woman, but not a Black woman. I was recently in New York, and there was this bartender who was, at least conscious on some level. And there was this Black woman that was at the bar, and she was talking about some of her struggles, and I kind of overheard. And so she goes, well, I'm a Black woman. And the bartender goes, well, why can't you just be a woman? And I didn't say anything at the time, but as reflecting back, it's like, because that's erasure, right? The intersectionality is there is a distinction between experiencing life as a white woman and experiencing life as a Black woman. And when we're whitewashed as kind of the magical Negroes are, we assume that we have the same privilege as white women. And we quickly, in the professional world at least, and in the personal world, we realize, no, 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 those privilege cards always decline. We never quite get them. And if we do gain access, it's at a cost. And usually that cost is pretty steep. So there's this exclusion of Black radical women from mainstream discourse. And there's definitely just not being present to what it means to be a Black powerful woman. And in fact, the Black woman side of you is very much whitewashed and watered down, and oh, you shouldn't be so, because anytime that you speak out against the oppression, against subjugation, against being a magical Negro, what happens? It's the same experience that happens as a Black woman, as a monoracial Black woman. How dare you? And there's always some sort of attack on the other side. So for me in my business, it would be, I would have to set a boundary with people. And, because that's part of what we do as holistic doctors is hold patients accountable. And so sometimes if they were not ready to be accountable to that, or they got triggered, then all of a sudden the bad Google reviews, or the chargeback on credit cards, or the canceling of contracts but not paying the balance off, and just using whatever lever of power that they have. How dare you set a boundary? How dare you not do, what I want you to do? Even if, you reinforce over and over again, this is the process, this is the practice, this is what needs to happen. It's like, no, 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 I'm not doing that. You're going to, and there's a real anger that I've experienced definitely from white women. I have experienced it some from white men, but white women especially, they get very angry if you don't allow that subjugation and you stand in your power. And so there is a huge difference between being a Black woman and a white woman, and that in ignoring that intersectionality is very dangerous in the mainstream discourse. So we've talked about a lot of the challenges of being a magical Negro. So now let's talk about the pathway forward. So if you are a magical Negro, biracial individual, and you can navigate identity with integrity. So it will take some heavy lifting on your part. I know for me, towards kind of some of the end of working on this particular piece, it was like working with my ancestors. I was like sifting and sorting and like, okay, this part I'm going to deal with. This part, that's on y'all. I'm giving that back to the line. I don't need to now again be this magical Negro that's supposed to transform and heal, all of these generational hurts and wounds. That's not my responsibility. I'm here to, transform what I'm responsible for and assist in my line. But I'm not here to, do all of this fast track work of 400 plus years. Like, forget it. And so part of this process of deconstruction is rejecting the colorblind conditioning from your white parents. So that looks like stop dragging them into the room with you. Stop. You always have to announce, oh, I have, it's just like, oh, I'm special. It's the othering. I'm not like them. I'm, magical. And so you've got to stop doing that and really just get rooted in your phenotypical race. So whether that is Black, whether that's white, whether that's indigenous, you really kind of sit in that and stay in that. And so the other thing too is engage with Black scholars, because like Dr. Francis Welling, Dr. Joy DeGroy, those were some really, like, when I hit the ISIS paper, it was like, whoa, okay, right? I'm not crazy, right? And even bell hooks, with the white gaze, even though I find that based off those other two juggernauts, it's like, woo. And so we just want to engage in Black scholarship and learn outside of the identities that your white parents have put on you. And also engage in Black scholarship in its full context. So, not only just, being around, but also, educating yourself privately, but also immersing yourself in Black culture. Now, you're going to go through all kinds of challenges with that. You are going to, have all these stories and all these ideals and all these things, and you're probably going to get your ass handed back to you many times, like I did, because I didn't check my privileges. Was not aware of so many different things, but that was part of my deconstruction. Again, it wasn't personal. It was part of my process of healing, being that magical Negro. And so also too, I think it's really important to recognize the role of biracial people in upholding white supremacy. So now biracial people are pretty much the foot soldiers of white supremacy when they come into rooms and spaces and they're like, oh, racism is okay. It's racism light, oh, it's okay, that my parents have said this, that, and the third to me. Oh, it's okay that, this has happened. Oh, it's okay. No, it's not okay. And so calling these things out, and we don't have the luxury of pretending like these things don't exist. Our mere state of survival is dependent upon this transformation. So where white people may have the privilege of not talking to their racist family members or not deconstructing that, again, it's not our place to help deconstruct our white family members. Don't get that wrong. But it's definitely not appropriate to continue to shrink yourself for the comfortability of the white people in your life. And so once you start speaking out and once you start, learning and getting into Black scholarship, just know that you're going to trigger the white family and friends that are in your life, and they have a choice. They can either look at themselves and they can do their own deconstruction process, or they're going to project and blame and try to subjugate And they're going to pull whatever power lever that they feel like they have. Even if they don't have any power lever, they're going to try because that's their conditioning. And so we want to not uphold white supremacy and this idea of whiteness. So we don't need to drag our white parent into the room with us, meaning we don't need to, tell everybody, oh, I have a blah, 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 no, it's just I'm black or I'm white and keep it cute, as they say. And so when you are presenting Black thought, we absolutely need to properly cite and uplift Black scholars without sanitizing their messages. So, Dr. Joy DeGruy's work, very powerful. We do not need to be in forced integration. I don't know how you whitewash that particular conversation, but it was done. and not naming any names, but it was wild. And then when I brought this to the forefront, of course, oh no, there's so much of that, and then there's the white splaining and the colorless world. We're here to work because the Black biracial or even the white biracial is always playing the middle. So Black people don't need to be the diplomats. We need co-conspirators. We don't need allies. I don't believe in allyship. I believe that allyship is more for the LGBTQs. Co-conspirators, and I and even to that makes me cringe a little bit. I'll be honest with you, because a white person can never really understand the struggles of a Black person unless they've walked in that shoe, which is it's not possible. But we've got to stop politicking. We've got to stop the respectability politics and making sure everybody feels comfortable and everybody, because our lives are dependent upon this. The Black maternal mortality rate, our healthcare systems collapsing, redlining, school to prison pipeline. There are so many historical and objective evidences now of what's actually occurring. And so we can't continue to uphold that. And if we do, we're just a part of the problem. And then we've got to unlearn this conditioning or deconstruct this conditioning of neutrality. You can't be neutral when it comes to oppression. You can't do racism light. And so we've got to make sure that you are very clear and very defined first in your identity and then also within your community. So this episode naturally is going to challenge a lot of people because it directly confronts the conditioning and social engineering of the biracial identity. I am a biracial person, so before you come for me, recognize that as a healer and as a doctor, this is also based off of my own personal healing and transformation. And this is part of the reasons why I became a holistic doctor, because my healing could not just be on one plane, because I didn't know all of this was going on in the background. I just thought, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm bad. I'm wrong. I need to be punished. Or why do I keep, going into these traumatic relationships? Or why is it that, I build something so great and so wonderful and then it's all taken away? And so I had to learn by trial and fire what was going on. And for me, I've always been a why child. And so I kept digging and kept digging and kept digging. And then once I really got to this ancestral piece, I did all my genetics. I did a lot of training in genetics and methyl genetics. And so I learned how to kind of trace back different things and look at different things. And as I began to do that, and then naturally working with plant medicines and working with different indigenous healers, this brought up what was unseen. This brought up what was hanging in the background that no psychology could have got me to. Now, in constellation, again, this is done in the spiritual realm. There was a lot of work that came up within this. There was a lot of dynamics that came up that were pretty fascinating. But by and large, I would say that the family constellation more so prepared my system, my nervous system, for what I was about to witness moving through with the plant medicines. And so these were all very intentional, the work that I did. It wasn't, something that I was just kind of unconsciously uncovering. I was very conscious that I wanted my own liberation. I didn't know how, I didn't know why, I didn't know all those things. I just knew that this pain that I was feeling was not normal. When I would go to, obviously, my father, he would shame me because he doesn't want to look at his own emotions. And then I go to my mother, she would talk about it, but more so make it about her. And so there really wasn't a space for me to actually be. And so I've had to learn to create my own space to actually be. And so this has allowed me to confront my conditioning and social engineering as a biracial individual to the point now where I've deconstructed and I'm just a Black woman. And so by incorporating Dr. Welsing, Dr. DeGroy, Malcolm X, Bell Hooks, we're really trying to provoke the necessary historical and psychological context to see how the system is structured, because this isn't something that I created. These are things that I went through with my own healing and transformed, and then I went to go seek out, knowledge and wisdom, and I think it was kind of like in the same point, right? Because I had been so burnt out from, being that magical Negro in Virginia and just being everything to everyone, that consume her culture, that I literally just, it was either I'm going to go nuts or I'm going to leave the country on my own terms and I'm just going to cool out for a year. And in that deconstruction over that year, I got into my exploitation wounds, I got into my unseen, unheard wounds. And so it really helped me. And then, of course, because I, was in a PhD for international psych, I also was learning too a lot about the cultural context. And then the election, I mean, it was like so much, it was like a pressure cooker of learning this. And so that's why I wanted to bring it out to you guys, because it doesn't have, I don't think it has to be as difficult as what it was. I just didn't have a roadmap. And so the system, it's important for you to understand how the system of racism is structured, who started it, when it began, why it was began, and how biracial identity is manipulated to serve white supremacy and uphold it rather than dismantle it. So definitely, I would love to hear your thoughts about upholding white supremacy. Again, every time I go into my Facebook or one of these places, and I see these interracial couples and they all look nice enough, and then they're, putting out their little magical babies, and then everybody in the car, oh my God, it's upholding this white fragility and upholding this white comfort and this illusion of progress simply because you've legislated for access to sleep with me. Why not legislate for access for me to have a healthy pregnancy and not be at risk for the Black maternal mortality rate? Why not legislate for our children not to be put into the school to prison pipeline? Why don't we legislate for redlining to not occur? Why don't we legislate for the things that actually matter systemically? Because every system has been pretty much poisoned with white supremacy, because that's how these systems began. And so I ask yourself, not to be all Dr. Umar on you, but I really, just ask you to question if you are interested in interracial dating, or you are currently in one, really think about the impact that you're going to have if you have a child. Now, if you've already had a child in an interracial relationship, now it's game on. Unfortunately, there's no time left to kind of contemplate, because now you have pretty much created more trauma in the world. And so now it's your obligation to help encourage, teach, deconstruct your child so that they have a healthy racial identity, so that they are not totally blind to it. Because let me tell you something, when you're conditioned in this colorless world, and then life, lets you know that you're not in a colorless world, and you're literally working up against resistance, it's very demoralizing, it's very disheartening, and it can plague on someone's mental, emotional, psychosocial, and spiritual state. So if you care about your children, you will deconstruct and inevitably help teach them how to deconstruct from these oppressive thought processes, from these ideals and beliefs that uphold white supremacy ideals. So, thank you guys so much for listening to another episode of Confessions of a Holistic Doctor. I am your podcast host, Dr. Erica Steele, and you have just watched or listened to, rather, not watched, listened to an episode of The Magical Negro.